All right, everybody, good morning. It's good to see you guys. We're glad that you're here on this Sunday morning, the first Sunday of 2020. It's strange to actually say that we've left 2019 and now we're into the 20s. Like, what are we going to call this? Like, is it the roaring 20s? What is this? What do the 20s become? We're not really sure. Some of you are like, listen, 2019, see ya, right? Like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And then others of you are like, man, 2019 was actually pretty good. Like, I'm not sure how 2020 could get much better than what it was. And so, whatever it is for you, we're glad that you're here. In fact, in the beginning of the new year, we're always kind of thinking about new things, new year, new you, right? Like I've been thinking about it. In fact, I've got this cart up here because it sort of symbolizes a lot of where we are in the beginning of the year. We're getting ready to eat better, to cook better, to be better, to be a better person. The other night, my kids I think we were watching a movie before bed, and I went to the kitchen to grab a snack, and I come back into the room and I have this like gigantic carrot, and I'm just chewing on a carrot, and everybody kind of looks at me like, what is wrong with you? And so the thing is, like, at these times of life, we're like looking at carrots and we're like, yeah, that's probably a better option for those of you. This is a carrot, okay? Maybe you need to go eat one of these, all right? But we're looking at better options. We're looking at replacing things in order to put other things in there in our lives, and we're looking to create a healthier you. And so I want to introduce you and welcome you to our 4-week series called Soul Care. We're going to be spending the next 4 weeks taking a look at how to become the healthiest version of yourself possible, a healthier you. We look back over the course of the year and you might say, you know what, here's 85 ways that I'm going to be a better person or I'm going to be a healthier person. And then in the next 7 days, what happens? You screw it all up. You're like, forget the carrot, like we're done with that, like bring on the potato chips, the kettle fried chips, right? And it's like, it's so hard to follow through with some of these things. And it's fascinating to me though. It's so fascinating because as a society, we move at such a feverish pace, with like a frantic pace. We have like ever-increasing responsibilities in your life. You've got your home responsibilities, your work responsibilities, your relationship responsibilities, and quite honestly, it's no wonder that we find ourselves just starved of meaning and living with a malnourished soul. And if we're not careful, we can very easily end up at the end of 2020 in the very same place that we were in 2019. We can find ourselves falling into patterns and habits, and we can say, you know what? Nothing actually changed. Like nothing got better the way that I had hoped that it would. See, we can end up being tired, worn out, beaten down, and quite honestly wishing for something more. 2,500 years ago, there was a prophet that spoke for the Lord by the name of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, he wrote these few words and said these words. He said this about our hearts. He said that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? Happy New Year, everybody. Like, woo, glad you came to church today. Like, glad you hear that, like, your heart is actually, it's lying to you. It's deceitful. And it's also sick. It's sick. So what your heart is telling you right now is, there's some of you in this room that are looking at me and you're like, I'm doing just fine, right? Like, I'm doing good. 2019 wasn't that bad, and actually, I'm kind of healthy. Your heart is telling you all of these things like, no, you're doing just fine. You're doing great. You're doing it on your own. You got it. And it also, it's desperately sick. Every single one of us. Our hearts are in need of healing. They're in need of care. And so we're going to be diving into this over the next 4 weeks of how do we care for our soul? How do we care for what's inside of us? In fact, too many people are running around with a malnourished soul, desperately in need of care. And one of the best ways for me to describe and define what your soul is actually put it this way. Your soul is the inner you, all right? That is the easiest way for me to define this. Your soul is the inner you. That person that you're having a conversation with right now, that might just be me, but that's okay. The person that you know everything inside of you, right? You know the thoughts that you haven't even shared with anybody. You know the desires that you haven't shared with anybody. You know the things that you've done. The inner soul is the inner you. In fact, King David writes this in Psalm 103, verse 1. Look at this. He says that, bless the Lord, O my soul. My soul, you're going to bless the Lord, right? Everything that's within me is going to bless his holy name. David, he defines the soul as everything that is within us, and he's saying is going to bless the Lord. The inner you, the soul, I'm afraid that from too often, we just allow ourselves to run through life without getting a checkup, without actually looking and being like, let's see what it is that we've got here. So we've got some celery. Celery is supposed to be healthy for you. I don't know about that. Anybody know what this is? Okay, good. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you all were awake and tracking with me. These are oranges. So I was shopping at Detweiler's the other day. I picked up one of these. Anybody know what this is? No, you're wrong. You need to eat some fruit. This is not a grapefruit. Somebody said it. Who said it? It's a pomelo. You just won yourself a free trip to Detweiler's to buy a pomelo. So I was wandering through Detweiler's and I'm looking around. I'm like, I want to get healthier. I want to eat some healthy things. And I came across a pomelo. It's actually a crossbreed. It's a Florida fruit between a grapefruit and an orange. It's like they had a baby and they came up with a pomelo. I don't understand, but it's good. You should try it, right? Like there's things that you and I should do that we should try in order to increase health inside of us. And so for the next 4 weeks, we want to discover what if. Like we're asking this question right up front. I want to ask you, what if you could infuse your life with some healthy practices that are going to help us maintain emotional, physical, and spiritual health over the course of this next year? Now listen, I'm crazy enough to think. I know I'm a type A control freak. I'm an Enneagram 3, which means like I've got it all planned out. But I'm crazy enough to think that if we develop some of these rhythms right now, that it not only will shape the course of this year, but it'll shape the course of this next decade as we look and see what God has in front of us. See, if our souls are actually unhealthy, everything around us becomes unhealthy because all of life flows from inside of us. The author of Proverbs, Solomon, writes this in Proverbs 4, verse 23. He says that above all else, you should guard your heart. Why? Because from it, everything else you do flows from it. Everything else comes from your heart, the place inside of your heart. Everything else is flowing out of that. So guard that. Work on your heart. You can have it all. You can have the car. You can have the dream job. You can have the 2.5 kids. You can have the house. You can have the spouse, the sugar mama that's going to fund it all too. And yet your insides can be completely empty. You can find that your insides are completely empty even though everything around you is what you thought and what you dreamed. See, until our souls are cared for, our circumstances won't matter. The things around us will not matter if what's going on inside of us is unhealthy. We have to pay attention. We've got to lean in. You can't afford to go through 2020 without paying attention to what's going on inside of your soul. Because it's funny that when you and I, when we look at our souls, when we kind of lean in and we're like, we're going to check this out, we're going to pay attention to it, we feel this nagging undernourishment inside of us. And then what we do is we typically run to all these external fixes. We start like doubling down on the efforts on the outside. We start, not eating rice, let's be real. We're not going to eat pasta either. But we're probably going to do a lot of fruits and vegetables, right? And we start leaning into all these external things, trying to fix what's going on inside of us. But we need to admit that the fastest way and the best way to fix what's going on around us is to actually fix what's going on inside of us. And so we've set that as our goal for the next 4 weeks to dive into this topic of soul care. And in fact, there's been a lot of people that have written about soul care. There's been many, many books, great books. But one of the books that I'd recommend, that I'm using this book actually as a kind of a framework and a guide throughout this series, is a book by Rebecca Lyons called Rhythms of Renewal. Rebecca does a great job of teasing out all these 4 areas in our life that we can develop rhythms of renewal and be healthier. And we're going to cover these things over the next 4 weeks, and we're going to find that actually Rebecca didn't discover these things. There's no author that discovered these things or defined these things. In fact, God baked them into the very DNA of our souls. But what she does point out so well is that there are actually 2 different rhythms that you and I experience that we need in order to have healthy souls. And the first one is we need to have an input rhythm. There needs to be things that are put inside that you continually do to feed yourself. But there also has to be an output rhythm. And so the input rhythms that we're going to talk about are rest and renewal. We're going to start with the first input rhythm of rest today. Next week we're going to talk about renewal, and then we're going to keep going into the output rhythms of connecting and creating. even those of us that have been following Jesus for years, maybe your entire life, we still find it difficult, find this a struggle. In fact, this morning, I want to pay attention to somebody who was a prophet of God's. Means he spoke for the Lord, and yet his soul was still deeply uneasy. This guy, he was deeply in turmoil. And catch this, after an incredible season of success, after a great year, and yet his soul was not at ease at all. I'm talking about Elijah the prophet. Elijah's story is found in 1 Kings, starting in, you can find it all over 1 Kings, but particularly today we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 16 and 18 and 19, and there was so much going on in Elijah. Now, when you hear the word prophet, you're probably thinking Fu Manchu beard like this dude and carrying some kind of staff that, he does like a prophet move on you, but that's actually not what it meant to be a prophet. A prophet actually was an individual that spoke for the Lord, but really it wasn't like he could tell the future necessarily, but he really understood the past. He understood what God was doing so that he could best lead people and point people to God and what God might do in the future. A prophet was his biggest role was to be able to speak on behalf of God. And here we find Elijah the prophet, and he's living in a time where there was an incredibly wicked king by the name of Ahab. In fact, I want you to hear what Scripture says about this king Ahab. Historically, it says this, that Ahab, the son of Omri, he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Right? Like you've got that toddler running around and you're like, how could this kid get any worse? And then they become a teenager and you're like, whoa, it got worse. And then they're like trying to figure it all out. This guy did more evil than anybody before him. That's how evil this guy was. And he even ramped it up because he married a woman by the name of Jezebel. Anybody have a daughter named Jezebel? No. You don't, because history doesn't smile favorably upon Jezebel. Jezebel actually was so evil. Jezebel was the daughter of a foreign king, so a neighboring king. And when Ahab married Jezebel, they brought in some of the foreign gods into the nation of Israel. They brought in some of the foreign cultures, and they started to mix. And you'll probably remember that God said, there should be no other gods before me. There should be nothing other than my relationship with you, Israel. And Ahab marries Jezebel and it's like, bring it on. The god of Baal and the god of Asherah, these false gods. And they started worshiping them. And this got Elijah's attention. And Elijah comes running up to him and he's like, you got to stop this. Like, you are leading people away from God. And God said to Elijah, I want you to tell King Ahab. I want you to tell King Ahab that there will be no rain in this land for 3 years. Because I want him to know, I want the nation of Israel to know that I alone am the one true God. I'm going to cut off all the rain, all of this, the moisture is going to be cut off. And here we find Elijah, wicked King Ahab, and his wife Jezebel. And 3 years later, God sends Elijah back to Ahab. And he says, call together a meeting with Ahab. And so what happened was Elijah met Ahab and the prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel. And Elijah says, hey, listen, we got to settle this once and for all. We're going to find out today. We're going to have a duel, right? Let's have a duel. Not like a gunslinger duel, but we're going to have a duel of the gods. Which God is the true God? Which God is more powerful? And here's what we're going to do. We're going to build an altar. And you're going to put a bull on that altar, and I'm going to put a bull on my altar. And then here's what, nobody's going to light the fire except for God. Whoever's the true God will show up and fire will fall. Now don't forget, they've been in a drought. It should be fairly easy to light fire at this time. And so, you know what? Elijah says, being the gentleman he is, he says, go ahead, you go first. And all morning, these 450 prophets of Baal and Asherah, they circled this altar and they were begging and pleading and praying that their gods would light this fire. And finally, they actually started cutting themselves as a sign of sacrifice of their own to just get their God to do this. Well, when they had enough of that, then Elijah said, all right, maybe your God is sleeping, right? Maybe he's on the can. And then he steps over and he says, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to actually, in order to prove God's power, we're going to get 3 big jars of water. I want you to pour it all over this altar over here. Like wet it all down. Because I don't even want anybody to have a hint of a thought that this just happened by accident. And so they did that 3 times. They soaked and saturated this altar, this wood. Everything was saturated. And then Elijah stepped back and he just prayed quietly and said, God, would you show up in fire so that the world would know that you alone are God? And boom, it happened. Fire fell. Scripture says that the wood burnt up, this offering burnt up, and all of the water around it just vaporized. It was gone. And everybody knew that Yahweh, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was the one true God. And if you're Elijah, wouldn't you be like, woo, I'm on top of the world, right? Like I am a powerhouse prophet. There is none that get better than me. That's what I would feel. I don't know about you, but that's how I would feel. And yet, Elijah felt the opposite. In a season of success, his very own soul was saturated with distress. Because after this moment, King Ahab goes back to Jezebel, and Jezebel looks and says, you're a dead man by tomorrow morning. And Elijah's like, full panic. And he runs away. He runs away, and in fact, this is what Elijah says. I love the Bible because the Bible is so filled with humanity. Like these people are real. Elijah, he runs away and he says, I've had enough, Lord. Like this is enough. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And he laid under a tree and fell asleep. Like Elijah's like, this is it. He's suicidal. He's depressed. He's feeling every kind of emotion. He's just experienced overwhelming success. And yet here he is laying down underneath of a tree, ready to throw it all away because it's just too much for him. And Elijah, we find that because of this, Elijah's circumstances may have been incredible. And yet, we're going to learn that one of the very first rhythms of this entire soul care comes from the fact that even though God showed up through power through Elijah, he desperately needed God to show up in power and minister to Elijah. And some of you today, you would say, you know what? I've been fairly successful. 2019 was great. Maybe your business grew. Maybe your finances grew. Maybe your family grew. Maybe 2019 was a year of growth for you. And you're looking at it and you're like, I don't know how 2020 could be any better. And yet it's possible. If it's possible for Elijah, it's possible for you and me that the state of our soul is unhealthy. Because catch this, seasons of success do not guarantee health for your soul. If we're going to find care for your soul, then we're going to need to learn the rhythm of rest. This is an input rhythm, a rhythm that builds into your life. In fact, the more that you practice this, the more fulfilled that it will bring you, more fulfillment it will bring you. We're going to find out that rest is critical to everything that you do. Because what is Elijah doing? What is he doing at this point in time? He fell asleep. The guy's laying down sleeping but there is a difference between sleeping and resting. I'll tell you that, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. But in his sleep, God shows up through an angel, and he says, all at once, an angel of the Lord touched him and said, get up and eat. So Elijah looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and he laid down again. Don't miss out on this. Don't miss on this little detail here. Elijah was so tired that he woke up, he ate something, and he went right back to bed. It's possible to say that Elijah was so depressed that he woke up, he ate something, and went right back to bed. I don't know if you've ever found yourself in that spot, but there have been seasons in my own life where I'm like, do I really have to get out of bed today? I don't know if that's what I want to do. This is where Elijah finds himself. And the angel of the Lord came back to him a second time and said, get up, eat, because the journey is too much for you. So he got up, he ate and he drank, and strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and he spent the night. See, the angel of the Lord came to him and he said, listen, I've got something for you, but you're not fully rested up for this. You're not fully prepared for this. In fact, there are times when you and I sleep to get away from stuff, and there's times when we sleep to rest up for stuff. And there's a big difference. But Elijah may have been a powerhouse prophet. He may have been at the top of his game, but he needed to learn the rhythm of rest. In fact, we find out here, not only from the angel, but also from his life, that we cannot run if we haven't rest. If we cannot rest, we cannot run. And it's a fact of life. We can only go so far. You can only go so far in your day and in your life without actually resting yourselves. You can find yourself at the end of the day overly tired, overly exhausted, and you can't move forward either because we lack drive or because we lack stamina. We may be emotionally spent, we can be spiritually spent, and we can be physically spent, exhausted. In either way, rest is critical. Have you ever found yourself like just unable to move forward? It's almost like there's something in front of you that's just like a brick wall. This past summer, if you've been around Hope City at any length of time, you heard me talk about this very honestly, that I got to the place where I felt so overwhelmed, not with church stuff, but actually everything at home. In the course of like 9 days, our house, there was a major crack in the facade of our house that then water has been coming in and probably coming in for years, and it deteriorated the interior wall. And so sheetrock is falling off the inside of my house, and I'm looking at that like, oh, that's strange, funny thing. And then it wasn't like much later than that, we were sitting in the living room, and Tiffany says, "Do you hear that?" Apparently, like an entire pack of rats moved in. They were having like a club, like a dance party above our living room doing their thing. And so we're like, okay, we got to deal with that. And then it wasn't but just a few days after that we took our youngest daughter to the dentist, and they're like, oh, by the way, she's probably going to need braces. And we're like, oh. So there's this everything. There's financial, there's emotional, there's physical. All this stuff is just coming to a screeching halt. And I'm looking at all of it, and I'm like, I don't know how to deal with all of this at the same time. Like I pulled sheetrock down, and then I just got like stuck looking at the wall. Like, now what do I do? And I typically I know exactly what to do. But in that moment, I couldn't move forward. It was too much. And it wasn't until I had some friends of mine that were like, hey, listen, we'll tackle the rats together. Hey, listen, let's handle the wall together. And then we can figure it out, right? That I was able to actually move beyond that. Because something in our culture, though, it says that busyness equals effectiveness. But guess what? Busyness does not guarantee effectiveness. Rest is the best way to guarantee effectiveness. To increase effectiveness, increase your rest. And this was true for Elijah, and it's true for you and I as well. Look at Elijah's story right here. It says, the word of the Lord came to him and said, Elijah, what are you doing here? I love this. I love Elijah, what he says. He goes, I've been very zealous for the Lord, God Almighty. Like, God, what do you mean, what am I doing here? I've been doing everything for you. Everything that I do is for you. Like, I do all this stuff. I wake up in the morning and I do stuff for you. I go to bed and then I wake up and I do stuff for you all day, over and over and over again. He says, the Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've broken down your altars and they've put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left. Elijah's like, look how good I am. I am the one true guy. I'm the one that's like holding fast to you. And guess what? God, I'm just so busy for you. And what does God say to him? He says, the Lord said, go stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. In other words, Elijah, I want you to experience my presence. I want you to stop this other stuff and just be present with me. Just rest. See, it's not about your doing, Elijah. It's about your being. Be still. Just rest. See, there was nothing that Elijah needed to do in order to earn God's presence. He needed to actually slow down and rest to engage in God's presence. His presence was experienced from a posture of rest. In fact, another way of saying this is that you and I, we don't run to earn rest. We run fueled by rest. We run by the rest that we already have. Too many of us find ourselves, we wake up in the morning, we try and prove to everybody that we're worthy of things. We try to prove that we're deserving of people's love. We try and prove to people that we're deserving of the material possessions that we have. I've worked so hard for this. I deserve this. And we get excited about proving and working and showing up. But rest doesn't work like that. Rest is the place that you run from, not the place that you run to earn. Elijah challenged 450 prophets, and he set a king and a queen in their place, and he pointed an entire nation back to God, and it played games in his mind. When God asked Elijah, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I've been super busy for you. I've been super zealous." Almost like, "How dare you ask what I've been doing or what I'm doing? Like, how did you not see all that I've been doing," right? And yet God said, "No, the most important thing, Elijah, is that you go and experience my presence right now." So Elijah set out to do that, and look what happens. He says, a great and powerful wind. It tore through the mountains, and it tore them apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. Surely God's in that, right? But the Lord was not in that. After the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord wasn't in the earthquake either. After the earthquake came a fire. Because, man, God showed up in the fire, right? Like he showed up at the mountain, Mount Carmel. He showed up there for sure. Everybody knew that. And yet, the Lord was not in the fire. And you find, like, God, you show up in the big stuff, right? Like, God, Elijah would be right to say, God, you show up in the biggest movements of life, right? God could be in the wind, after all. Like, he's all powerful. God could be in an earthquake. God could be in a fire, and yet he was not. And so many of us, if we're totally honest with ourselves, we roll into church on a Sunday morning and we're disappointed that God did not show up in fire in your life, in earthquake in your life, or in some massive windstorm in your life. In other words, we're disappointed when God doesn't show up in the miraculous, when he doesn't show up in the magnanimous, in the huge aspects of life. We become so acquainted to the idea that if God is true, then that God is going to provide all these things. God's going to give you a raise, right? Well, that would be wonderful, God. That would be, everybody would know that you're God. Or God's going to heal and restore my marriage or my relationships, and therefore everybody would know that you alone are God. Or God's going to restore a relationship, or he's going to he may even heal somebody. And yet there are times in your life when those things do not happen. And you can be deeply disappointed. But we're going to learn from Elijah, and we should learn from Elijah, that sometimes God moves in other ways. In fact, Elijah learned that God doesn't always move in these huge ways. Because just like Elijah, God is trying to teach us something. Look at this. It says that after the fire came, a gentle whisper. There came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, do you know what he did? He pulled up his cloak over his face, and he went out and he stood on the mouth of the cave. Because he knew that you couldn't look at God and live. And so he pulled his cloak up because he was so aware of God's presence. God, I know you're here, but I'm not even going to do that. The fire, the earthquake, the wind, it all passed and God was not in it, but guess what God was in? He was in a gentle whisper. I am standing here in the beginning of 2020, and I am so excited for what God may whisper to you this next year. Like what God might whisper in your life even today. Yeah, sure, we want the fire to fall. We want to feel like, man, everything's changed. We want to see our bank accounts change, relationships change, everything changed instantly, sure. And yet, what if God's just whispering and trying to get your attention and trying to draw you closer to himself? Elijah was so busy doing. He was so busy proving that he almost missed out on the experience and the presence of God. See, sometimes God moves in a very slow and small and quiet way. Because I think, just like Elijah, if you and I, when we're restless, or we are most restless, When we rest less, when we stop resting, we become restless and we start doing and we start busying ourselves and straightening up things and reorganizing and missing out on being able to hear what God is trying to say. Sometimes I think we miss out on the voice of God because we aren't intentionally resting in our lives. And I'm not talking about sleeping. It's not the same as resting. It's a component of resting. But you know what happens when you're resting? God can bring you a word. God can bring you a vision. God can bring you some instruction. God can bring you an experience. And I love the story of Elijah because it reminds me that God is a personal God. That God had a personal word for a powerhouse prophet. Like a man whose very job was just to speak for the Lord, and yet God said, no, this one is just for you. This one's just for you. Like if you search scripture, you're like, okay, so what was it that Elijah actually experienced? What happened in that moment? What did God say? It was personal. Like we don't have those words because it was meant for just him. And there's something in me that says, you know what? Today, God may just be whispering something specific to you that is only meant for you. How few things are personal anymore in our life? Like, I know what you had for dinner last night. It's a nice picture, by the way. But, like, we don't need to know what you ate. I like to know where you ate. I know when your kid had his first bath. Like, we document that, and then we share it with everybody. Some things are personal. Like, there are some things that I tell one of my kids that does not apply to another one of my kids. In the same sense that there are some things that I tell my wife that would be inappropriate if I told anybody else. There are some things that are meant to be personal, and God is a personal God. He is a God that said, listen, I love you so much that I want to have a personal relationship with you, that I'm sending my son Jesus to die on a cross so that you and I could be made right, so that we could know each other. Not some distant religion, but some very close and intimate relationship. See, without rest, we miss out on this. Without rest, it is so easy to teeter on the edge of burnout and miss out on the life that God has planned for you. In fact, let me say it this way, that you won't experience the life that God wants for you if you don't first experience the rest that God designed for you. You're going to miss out. You're going to miss out. It's going to happen. Every week during this series, we've intentionally structured a challenge for you this week. And I don't know if you're ready for this week's challenge, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. If we're going to care for our soul or the innermost you, we're going to start with rest. And I want to challenge you this week to establish rhythms of rest. Here's what a few things could look like, a few rhythms of rest that you might want to add to your mix this week. The first thing is, can I suggest that in order to rest, that you take a tech detox? That you find some time in this week, I don't care when it is, I don't care how long it is, but an intentional rest from technology. See, resting from technology, it allows us to slow down and actually to make space to examine some of our blind spots. Sometimes there are just so many noises, so many notifications, so many pings, so many things that need our attention that it's even hard to hear yourself think. When we take a break from technology, what it's also doing is it's allowing us to be present and aware of other people in our life. It gives us greater capacity to be, for empathy to grow in the moment that's right in front of us. So maybe for you, that might be your phone, that might be social media. Maybe this week you want to spend, 1 or 2 nights television free. You're just like, I'm not going to do it this week. I'm not going to do it that night. Maybe for you, that would mean taking a break from podcasts or music as you're driving around and just driving in silence, the way that Henry Ford decided it should be, right? But if we're not careful, honestly, the very thing, the technology that's meant to help us, that we actually can become a master to it, it was meant to serve us. Second thing that I think you can do to increase your rest is to just find time to get quiet. What if this week you eliminated some noise? You went for a walk in a place where you could not be reached, and you had an opportunity to just get quiet. See, quietness allows us to expand and to grow our awareness of others around us. Sometimes we fill our lives with so much noise that I don't even know what it is that you've said, but I just listened so that I could reply. Quietness allows us to listen so that we can understand. And when we understand, we respond in an entirely different way. And our relationships are going to change and grow, and our understanding of what God may be trying to say to us, we can listen because we've decluttered the noise and we're distraction free. When we get quiet long enough, it provides a refuge for your soul and for the souls of the people around you to be cared for. Third thing, which few of us you're not going to be too excited about this, but I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's important. It's that I think we need to examine ourselves and confess. We need to practice examination and confession because one of the biggest things that robs us of rest is regret. And regret, if you let that hang out in your life for too long, it gives birth to shame. And shame is a ruthless taskmaster that will not let you sleep. It will not let you run. It will not let you hide. Shame, it just hangs out in your head, and shame is continually causing you to scan the horizon saying, who knows about this thing? Who knows about that thing that I'm trying to hide? Now what do I need to do to recapture my image? What do I need to do in order to make sure that nobody else finds out about this? Shame has to be put to death. And examining your life and confessing that is the quickest way to eliminate shame and regret. Because guess what? You cannot heal from what you hide. And if we examine it and we confess it, we bring it to the light, that secret that you thought that feels so powerful, it loses all power the moment that you utter it. Ask yourself these three questions. What do I need to confess? What do I need to release? And what do I need to change? You're going to find that examination and confession is one of the key ingredients to having a healthy time of rest. One of the other things that you can do is you can practice something that's very, very incredibly biblical. In fact, God commanded this. He spoke this into the 10 Commandments. He said you should practice Sabbath. And the irony of Sabbath, though, is that very few of us understand what Sabbath is. And the majority of us, this is the only commandment of all 10 that we boast about breaking. Like nobody runs around and is like, yeah, so I stole from my neighbor. It was awesome. Nobody says that. But here's what we do say. Oh, I have been so busy. Like I haven't taken a vacation in 5 years. A day off? What's a day off? And we wear that like a badge of honor. And yet, God, the very creator of your soul, of your body, of your mind, he also baked into us our need for Sabbath. Because Sabbath is one day of 7, one day of the week, where you set aside productivity in order to increase play and prayer. A Sabbath day is prayerfulness and playfulness. It's the easiest way for me to describe that to you. What is it that you want to do on your Sabbath day? What is it that refuels you? What is it that actually brings you closer to the Lord? What allows you to spend more time in prayer and reminds you of this? See, Sabbath is an uncluttered time in which you and I can distance ourselves from what we have to do, from our own activities long enough to see what God is doing in the world around us. If I'm honest with you, the hardest thing for me to do is practice Sabbath. Because on a Sabbath day, and for me, my Sabbath is on a Friday into Saturday morning. And it is so incredibly hard for me not to check email, not to jump on and see what it is that, what's going on in the world around me, what's happening in church, what's happening with other staff members, all that stuff. But on that day, what I'm actually doing is I'm saying, guess what, God? It's not about me anyway. I'm not controlling this thing. I'm not running this show, running this ship. You are. And Sabbath may look weak to some people, but it's actually not weakness. Sabbath is actually an incredible practice. It's an incredible exercise of trust. Because on that day, you're saying, guess what, God? I'm going to trust that you're in control and I'm not. I'm going to trust that while I'm not working, you still are. I'm going to trust that when I step back, you're leaning in. And Sabbath allows us to grow and to rest. And the last one, and there was a big amen said with this, is that I'm going to encourage you to sleep deeply this week. I know I said that sleep is not rest, but sleep is a part of rest. In fact, there's a Harvard study that says that if you don't sleep, if you don't get adequate sleep, you are less likely to be able to learn, to retain information. You have a higher likelihood of increased risk in accidents. There is all kinds of things that say that your mood, your judgment, and your abilities will be impaired if you aren't sleeping enough. So this week, figure it out. Find some ways to sleep better. Like maybe stop being such a cheapskate and lower the AC by like 1 degree. Your wife will thank you. I don't know. Maybe you just need to take some. This is a smartphone for a reason, because you can tell it that at a certain time it should start dimming the background of your phone so that your eyes aren't constantly being entertained. Some of you have smart lights in your house that you can automatically dim at a certain time of the day, and it's not only triggering your body, but it also starts to fulfill the natural rhythm of sunlight diminishing at the end of the day. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he said this. He said, "Finish each day and be done with it. Tomorrow's a new day." Some of you just need the permission to turn it off at the end of the day. God designed you to get rest. He designed your body to sleep. And I think that if you get intentional with your waking hours, that you can make the most of your sleeping hours. So which one of these things is jumping off the screen to you? Whatever that is, maybe it's a couple. I would encourage you this week to develop rhythms of rest. To find one or two of these things, maybe all of them, I don't know, but put it into practice, because I'm convinced that you won't experience the life that God has intended for you, that He's planned for you, if you don't first experience the rest that God designed for you. And I don't want you to miss out on all that God has for this next year, and I'm crazy enough to believe even this next decade, as we establish rhythms of rest to care for your soul.